Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Braden Knudsen. I'll be your host for this webinar today. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us for another webinar. As we go through our announcements, we'd like to invite you to participate in the polls that we have down at the bottom of the screen. So our next webinar will be on Tuesday, October 17th at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And that webinar will be by Catherine Grant, titled Taking Advantage of Record Hints on the Family Tree Person page. So that'll be a good one. I hope to see everybody come join us again for that one. And today we'll be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Digital Race for Genealogy Books and Records. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star blog and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is the co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. As we turn the time over to James, just remind everybody about our questions box on the right-hand side. Questions are always welcome. And one thing to point out, on the top of the presentation screen, there should be a little bit of some arrows that you can turn the screen full screen. If you feel like it's not quite big enough for you to read, you can expand it to full screen so you can have a little bit bigger of a screen. And we'll turn the time over to James.
Howdy, this is James Tanner. Glad to be here for another BYU Family History Library webinar. Remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. We're going to talk today about the digital race for genealogy books and records. There actually isn't a race. It's more of it is a race to see who can get it all done fast, because they really are digitizing a lot of records. For example, the familysearch.org website has a section on digital books. You may not be able to find it, but it's under the search tab and it's called books. And there's a simple search with an advanced search that you can search in the digital books. There are about 365,000 books on there that have been digitized, all of them having to do with genealogy. Most of them that came from the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. This is one example, and Family Search is digitizing hundreds and hundreds of those books every month and adding to that. You can watch it go up by the thousands if you just keep going back and looking at the total number. So it's an interesting situation here where we have, of course, books are being written and added to, but the historical records that we need for genealogy are essentially finite. They were written and established during the time periods in the past. And what we're doing is taking those paper records, the records that were on paper, and turning them into digital copies. That means they're being scanned either on a variety of different kinds of book scanners, or they're being scanned by cameras, or whatever different kinds of devices there are out there. We're going to kind of focus on books and other records that are in a kind of codified on paper format. And these records are scattered all over the world and in lots of different languages. I was just looking at the statistics for the Library of Congress, and they have millions, literally millions and millions of books. And interestingly enough, only half of those are in English. The other half are in all the other languages of the world. So half the books in the Library of Congress are in some other language besides English. Kind of interesting. But obviously, if you go back far enough in your ancestry in the United States, you're probably going to run into somebody who spoke language other than English at some point in time. Even if you're all your ancestors, if this was making you kind of unique, if all your ancestors came directly from England and they were all English, I can assure you that going back far enough, they did not speak what you would recognize as English very much, very long ago. So there's, this, all of us have to think about the time depth and the amount of information and where these records are and all of that information. And it's all turning to digital. And which it would be very simple if it were all in one huge pile and all we had to do was go search through that one huge pile. But unfortunately, it's scattered all over the internet. Um, and the rate of digitization is dramatic. One of the things I hear when I talk about this, just almost like a patterned reaction, something that is pre-programmed into genealogists, is the same statement over and over again. That is, well, all the records aren't digitized. Well, the answer is, yeah, that's true, they aren't. But how do you know which ones of the ones you're looking for are digitized? That's, there's kind of a thing you can come back with. Uh, but the answer to that is, in essence, is yeah, they're being digitized extremely rapidly. Um, for example, earlier this year in 2017, uh, Family Search, kind of without any fanfare, dumped about 1 billion records into the FamilySearch.org website, which show up now in the FamilySearch.org catalog. They're not contained yet in the historical record collections, although they're being added to the historical record collections at a rapid rate also. In addition, for example, FamilySearch.org or Family Search has a team of people out digitizing records. There are almost right around 300 different cameras operated by 600 different volunteers, missionaries for the church, who who are scattered all over the world, digitizing records at a furious pace, millions and millions each year. So, this is a tremendous effort that's being done by many organizations, Library of Congress, uh, National Archives. All these people have digital projects, the large digital projects, newspaper projects all over the world. But books primarily have been a focus for some time in all of this effort. And the truth is that no one can really determine the total number of books that have been digitized. Each of the entities, the companies and organizations and institutions that are digitizing books have their own number. They know how many they've digitized to date, maybe, if they've kept track. But on the other hand, no one has a way of accumulating all of the records that are in all of these different websites out there. And I see the numbers go up just almost incredibly. As I've watched, the numbers include another one, for example, My Heritage, about a year ago added in, or a little more than a year ago, added a collection of records of digital books primarily, and other records like periodicals and things like that. About almost 500,000 of these were added to the myheritage.com website. They're fully searchable, fully digitized, available to be added as sources or act as sources for the people you have on myheritage.com. There are other large repositories of just plain genealogy books, but when we're looking at the greater number of books out there, we really have a huge number of books that are being digitized just sort of generally. And the question I get back is, well, how many of those books are interesting to genealogists? And I go, well, who knows? No one knows. But we can assure you that there are books that are being digitized that are of interest to genealogists, because they don't stop. They don't just decide not to digitize genealogy books. So in addition to the institutions and organizations that are specifically digitizing books valuable to genealogists, there are any number, probably thousands and thousands of organizations out there that are digitizing records just sort of generally without even considering whether they are or are not valuable to genealogists. So there are tens of millions. Google made an estimate that there were something like 243 million books that had been printed in the world. I have no idea how they came to that number and whether it is at all accurate. But the number of records in the books and records in the largest libraries in the world, like the Library of Congress, number into the tens of millions. And of those, there are probably many, many times that number that have been digitized that are not all in the Library of Congress or any other library for that matter. So when we're looking at all those books that have been digitized, what are the kinds of books that are out there online that would help genealogists? And this is helpful to know what kinds of things we need to go out and look for. Nobody is going to hand you a book and say, this is the book about, well, maybe they might if you have a friend that's really doing a lot of research and happens to run across it. But there, it's not a way that you're going to know that any particular book might be helpful to your family or doing your research on your particular family lines. But the advantage that happens today is that these books that are being digitized are also being completely indexed. Now, how do you completely index a book? Well, print books that have print, can be read by the computer with a program called optical character recognition, or OCR. And it's not perfect, but it's more than adequate for the use by genealogists. And there are most of the larger websites that are digitizing the books, like MyHeritage or like Family Search or like archive.org, which is a place where a lot of digital records are going that are pertinent to genealogy right now. That's archive, archive.org, archive.org, and it has about 14 million volumes just in books right now, with all the other stuff that it has, which it has millions and millions of other things on that one website. So here's the kinds of things that we're talking about. And we're going to go through in just a number of categories, and I'll comment on each of them as we go through. Historical society publications, and I'll come back to these in more detail in just a minute. But throughout the United States and throughout the world, there are lots of historical societies. I would venture that I know that there is at least one major state historical society in every one of the 50 states in the United States. And in most of the foreign countries have their own historical societies, and many of them divided up in geographical areas. And each state has one. Many of the counties within the United States, I would guess most of the counties with any sizable population, have a historical society or a museum of some kind that's part of the county organization. So these people publish lots of things, and we're going to talk about how we find these various types of organizations. Biographical works, we all can trace our ancestry back to thousands of ancestors, potentially. Maybe we can't do it realistically, but we can. We still have that vast number of ancestors, whether we realize it or not. And it's possible that one or more of those people had someone write a book about them, get a biography of them. And I'm fortunate enough to have a couple of published biographical works of some of my ancestors. It needs to know if you should go out and look for these. You always need to find out. So I'm going to talk about with each of these categories. I'm going to highlight how you go about searching for that particular category of information online. And then you have genealogical journals and other publications. Lots of genealogical societies out there, and some of them publish journals. And there are other kinds of genealogical publications out there. There are a couple of companies that specialize in publishing genealogical material. There are state, county, and local histories. These have nothing to do with historical societies. Sometimes the historical society is the entity that created the history of the county, but many times people have just written histories about their county. And some of these date back into the 1800s, 1700s, and they are very helpful because if your ancestors lived in those counties at the time, there's a distinct possibility that they're mentioned or even highlighted in some of these local histories. And so it's important to understand that these types of books exist out there. There's a large category of books called surname books, and a surname book takes an individual who has a particular surname, that's why it's called a surname book, and either traces their ancestry or traces their descendants. So they may take a famous ancestor in my family line, the Tanner family line, for example. We have a, an ancestor who has pretty local is famous locally here in Utah. His name is John Tanner, and there's a book called The John Tanner and His Family, and there are other books out there on surnames. And most of the people who visit the Family History Library in Salt Lake or any other genealogy library are sometimes overwhelmed by the number of surname books that are available, and also the fact that their own family may have one that they're totally unaware of. And many of these are the ones that are being digitized onto FamilySearch.org. So, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, the categories themselves don't tell the whole story. In other words, you can look at these different categories of records, and then you actually need to spread beyond that. You need to start doing searches in all sorts of areas and information. Okay, so let me give you an example of something that's not going to fall in one of my categories. Um, Throughout the United States, we have a lot of agricultural organizations. We have a lot of co-ops. We have a lot of different kinds of things. I once did a compilation of the number of agricultural organizations that had existed in the state of Utah, and there was an entire page, like 2 columns of 10 12-point type, small type, single-spaced list of just the agricultural organizations in the state of Utah, most of which dated clear back to the early settlement time in Utah, and were still in activity. And each of them had kept records and had newsletters and had books and all sorts of publications that went along with these agricultural things. So if your family came from someplace that had an agricultural base, you can get into agricultural magazines and maybe find more information out about your family. It's very, very possible, especially if your family came from the Midwest and your family was part of a co-op or something. You might find some very interesting things out about your family as you begin to look in these. Now, in addition, there's a whole different category here of instructional books, guides, manuals, and textbooks. If you listen to what they say when they introduce this, you realize that I've helped and co-authored or authored something over 25 books that are out there published on Amazon. So there's lots of stuff out there. There's lots of books that have been written about how to do genealogy. One of my interests is collecting older genealogy materials, books primarily, that have been published. I've got books back to 1915, the first set of lessons that was created by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to teach genealogy to its members back in that early time period. In fact, you could get a copy of it too if you'd like. It's online, digitized, completely available on archive.org, the website that I've already mentioned once. So there's just lots of things. There's also things like genealogy for dummies and things like that. Okay, and general history and geography. Most of the time, unless you happen to have an extremely prominent ancestor, which is possible, they're not going to show up in a general history or geography book. But the fact about this is that genealogy is history, and knowing about genealogy about history is one of the keys to understanding and doing good genealogical research. So I would suggest that learning the history of any of the places where your ancestors lived is a valuable activity. Social and cultural commentaries out there, yeah, there's a lot of those, and they might help you understand what has happened, what was happening at the time that your ancestors were alive. Transcripts and reproductions of records. Many places, many early records in the United States have been transcribed and reproduced, or both, transcribed and reproduced in book format. So rather than looking in an archive for the original documents, you can go to a book where the records have been either transcribed or abstracted. That means summarized, or actual images have been produced in the books of the original records. So there's lots of books out there in that category. The last one is archive and library publications, and you might be surprised to find out that how many different libraries across, well, just in the United States, not counting all the other countries of the world, but how many libraries and archives have published guides online or in paper form to doing genealogical research. So this is, there's a whole thing here. Okay, so we're going to start out with and looking at these in more detail by looking at the periodical source index on Find My Past. Now this is called PERSI, P-E-R-S-I. It's a comprehensive index of articles and records in historical, genealogical, and ethnic publications. There's over 2.7 million fully searchable entries that allow you to discover new records and resources you may not have encountered elsewhere. Now, many genealogists are familiar with and have used the PERSI, or Periodical Source Index, for years, but I don't know that many of them are aware that it has now been published online, freely, available through Find My Past, which, by the way, is a subscription website. But there's a couple of ways to look at it for free. Some libraries have copies available of Find My Past, but you're more likely to and will find a copy of the program in the family search portals that are available for free in each of the over 5,000 family history centers that there are around the world. So if you don't want to subscribe to the program, you can go into a family history center and use it for free, finding one close to where you live. Otherwise, you can subscribe and get access to the PERSI as part of many of the millions of other records that are on findmypast.com. Okay, so Historical Society publications. This is the Massachusetts Historical Society, which was founded back in 1791. And they began writing about the history, local history in Massachusetts back at that early date, and talking about lists and having lists of records and people, and talking about taxes and brands and all sorts of strange things. When I say brands, I don't mean like brands of food or brands of merchandise. The brands I'm talking about are the kind that they use to mark livestock with, cows and sheep and horses that are branded in different ways. There's actually two ways to brand animals like that. One is by using a hot branding iron and actually burning it into the side of the animal, which of course sends different types of people into a tizzy, but it's what's been happening for like the last 15,000 years or so. The other one, which also makes all sorts of people get upset, is called ear notching, where they cut patterns into the ears of the cows and the sheep and the horses so that they can distinguish who's or who's. There's just, it's interesting how but these things, rather than looking at the moral or immoral implications of what ranchers and cattlemen and have been doing for thousands of years, we should be looking at it from a genealogical standpoint and understanding that if we get into these historical society publications, we may very well find information about our ancestors simply because they registered a brand. And so this is something that you might not be aware of. So what you're going to do when you search for a historical society publication is search for historic. The two words I have a word in quotes because I'm telling you when it's in quotes, that means that you don't want it to search, that you don't want it Google to search for historical and society separately. You want them to search for those two words, historical society. And if you put them in quotes, then that would mean that Google would search for both historical and society as same time. So they're going to look for the two words together, historical society rather than historical and everything else under society. Okay, and put in a location. So if I want to find a historical society from Massachusetts, I put in quotes, historical, quote, historical society, unquote, and then I put Massachusetts. Think up comes the Massachusetts Historical Society and every other historical society in Massachusetts, of which there are dozens. So this is one way to get into these publications. They will then have a list of their publications, and then the next step is to take the names of the publications or the name of the society and do a search online for digital copies. So put the word digital, look for Historical Society, Massachusetts Historical Society in this case, and then put in the word digital and see whether or not they've digitized anything out there. So these are what I'm putting up on the screen, and for those of you who aren't watching on the screen, what it is screenshots of old historical collections from the Massachusetts Historical Society, and these go back, date clear back into the 1700s. So this is what I put up was a copy of the collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society dating back to 1798. An old publication, all this digitized online. And these, by the way, that I've copied are free. I didn't, I'll tell you if I got into one of the subscription websites, but most of this stuff came from either Google or from archive.org. So the two places where you could go to get most of this kind of digital stuff. Just kind of a side note on that on Google. Google, when they began their company, had as a corporate goal to digitize every book ever published in the whole world. Well, they ran into a long distance problem with various interests in the United States over the copyright issue. They got involved in one case with a big lawsuit filed by the Authors Guild and many other people against Google. And that made its way slowly through the federal district courts until about a couple of years ago, when it finally was decided in favor of Google at the Supreme Court level, and the whole issue kind of disappeared, even though the Authors Guild said they were going to file another lawsuit. I haven't ever seen where they have. Maybe they have, but it's not being prominently talked about in the media. But basically, what those lawsuits with Google determined was that these big organizations who are digitizing this material, even when it's copyrighted, have what is called the doctrine of fair use, which allows these organizations to copy these documents. Now, to get around the issue of the copyright, now, if you have during your lifetime ever gone into a public library or a school library or university library and checked out a book, I'm guessing you checked out a book that was copyrighted at some point in time. And that copyrighted book was sitting in a library, and you could walk in and copy and check that book out of the library, and then you had to take it home and read it and then bring it back to the library after whatever the time period was, 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever the loan period was. The reason they can do that is because libraries are an exception to the copyright rule in the sense that they have the physical copy of the book, and so then they can loan that physical copy of the book out. Well, now we get into the digital world, and the digital world has got an analog out there. That means it has a way of doing the same thing. We have online libraries. Okay, the most The most prominent of these from the commercial standpoint is a big library called Overdrive, just like it sounds, Overdrive .com. And if you go to Overdrive, you'll find out that they're kind of a centralized representative for hundreds and thousands perhaps of public libraries across the country. And using your local library card, you can check out digital books for a time period, 2 weeks or whatever. Usually with Overdrive, it's 2 weeks. And what happens is you check the book out. You have a digital copy which you can read on one of your devices, on a computer, on an iPad, or on a phone, or whatever, a smartphone, or whatever, a tablet of some kind, a Kindle. And then you can, and at the end of that time period, then the book is automatically checked itself back in. So you then either have to go find it again and check it out again if you haven't finished reading it, or in some cases you can actually renew your borrowing period if someone else isn't out there trying to find the same book, just like you could in a physical library. Now, yeah, the interesting thing is that let's say the average small town library, like we live here in Provo, and the public library here may have somewhere between 200,000 or 300,000, maybe as many as 500,000 books in it, entirely in the whole library, everything included. Well, uh, these online libraries are getting into very large ones. Now, Overdrive contracts with the local libraries. So the local library supplies the link to Overdrive. And so the number of books handled by Overdrive is dependent on the funding received by the local library or the interest or whatever of the local library. So we find a tremendous variation in the number of books offered through different public libraries. For example, in my case, we have, since we lived in Arizona, we had the Greater Phoenix Digital Library, which had tens of thousands of books. In fact, it had almost as many books as you would find in the average large public library, and they were kept very up to date. If you wanted to read newer books, they had all the new stuff coming out on digital. Okay, we moved to Utah and found out that Utah's library was not nearly quite as robust as the Greater Phoenix Digital Public Library. Not any kind of reflection on Utah. Yes, it is, but the fact is that it has to do with the amount of population. There's actually more population in one county in Arizona than the entire state of Utah. So it's not surprising. But on the other hand, we found that we could also continue to use that library, that online digital library, uh, because but we would have to pay a fee for the annual use. And so that's how we could still continue to subscribe to a larger library. So understanding that. Now, let's get to the real crux here is that there are online digital libraries that are huge. There's one called openlibrary.org. It's associated with archive.org. And Open Library has over 1 million digital books that you can look at and hundreds of thousands of them, larger than most, even larger than most larger city libraries, that are free and open, and you can download and read the books. They're just checked out. So you get a time period, usually 2 weeks, and you check out the book just like you would. You read it on your device and it checks itself back in. So if you start looking out there, you'll find out that there are dozens and dozens of these websites, even including websites like Amazon that allow you to check out books and read them if you pay the fee and get that reading capability. So we're going to go on now back to our list here, and we have biographical works. I mentioned the importance of that, and this one is the history of Bristol County, Massachusetts, but it actually has a whole set of biographical information in there, usually only of the very prominent people, and sometimes they were only included if they helped fund or pay for the book. But the benefit that we have is that these pioneers and prominent men usually did help pay for the book, And some of these books date back, as I mentioned earlier, there was one back in the 1700s. This one's back into the 1800s that this book was published, The History of Bristol County, Massachusetts, with biographical sketches of the pioneers and prominent men. Now, there seems to be some kind of an issue here with genealogists who seem to think that old books don't have any value because, and they usually say, because they don't have the sources. Well, by the way, this book was written back in the 1800s, probably if your family came from Bristol County, Massachusetts, or any other county that added this kind of a history. They were writing about contemporaries. They weren't writing about their ancestors. They were writing about people who were your great, great, great grandparents or even more. And that's as close to the information as you're going to get when you're talking about these books. So we need to understand that they are valuable because they are old. And so we can get into them. Of course, you know, if they're unfortunately, sometimes the standards of academic standards and adherence to the truth and sourcing were not observed. So that goes to the weight or to the reliability of the information, but it's there and it may be helpful and interesting. And these books are extremely helpful if your ancestors were pioneers in the community. So if you find them into a small town like, you know, Des Moines, Iowa, not so small, a big city now, but Des Moines, Iowa, and you find out that they were one of the first pioneers that arrived in that part of the country, very, very likely that they end up in the history books. So you're going to look for these, you're going to search for history or biography with the state or the county or the city. So you're going to say history of Arizona, history of Massachusetts, of Georgia, of wherever, county, county of Juab, county, Utah, history of, you know, Cochise County, Arizona. There's going to be a history book on that county. And I can assure you that there's probably one on almost every county in the country. Genealogical journals and other publications. Here's an example of that. This is the New England Historical and Genealogical Register from 1879. This particular publication is one of the longest running genealogical records in the United States, and it is just encyclopedic with the number of people that it talks about and the number of records that it discusses. It's just basically a very valuable source. And interestingly, these particular ones have been digitized completely by Google as well as by archive.org. Both of those two websites seem to have a lot of these publications, and they're completely searchable. So you can go in and look for back in these old volumes of the register and look for your surnames of your family and find information and records that you may otherwise not know that exists. And you're going to search for journal with the word genealogy and with the location. Now you'll notice the one that I have as an example is called a register. Well, you might start looking for other words too besides journal. You might look for register or publication or anything that would be associated, the name of the words that are associated. A simple thing to do is go look for synonyms. Go into Google, say define journal or synonym journal, and they'll come up with 10 or 15 terms you can use for search terms to find these additional publications. When you're talking about state and local histories, then you get into a different area. These are not published for purposes of doing genealogical research. They are, the fact that they talk about the people who lived in the county is incidental. It's just part of the history. If your people lived in the county and were part of the history or the state or the local place, then they would be included in the book. Now you're going to see evidence, and you get into this, you're going to see evidence of favoritism. You're going to see people who are prominently displayed in the books, usually the people who published it or the people who paid for the publication, as I mentioned earlier, or the fact that your people were either poor or not as socially accepted as the rest of the people that are in the publication. I just got a comment on one of my blog posts that was extremely interesting. It was about a small town in northern Arizona where my ancestors lived, and they were they were Mormon pioneers, and they settled this community called Joseph City, Arizona. And the person who wrote to me had lived in the town when he was very young, many, many years ago, and was kind of put out that none of his family had been mentioned in the histories that he was aware of. Well, I'm not sure that he wasn't, but his impression was that his family was not would not have appeared in the histories because they were not members of the predominant religion. Well, members of the prominent religion is not restricted to people in the West who were or were not Mormons. It had to do with a lot of different situations. The members of the predominant religion in Massachusetts were often forced out of the states in the early colonial years, and all went, well, not all, but many of them went to live in Rhode Island, where my ancestors lived. So, there's all sorts of interests here, but what we're looking for here are history books, and I chose one from Grayson County, Texas. This one happened to be published by the Grayson County. So this was a book that they published, and it's quite recent, and it was online, digitized, completely available. It had pictures of groups of old pioneers and early settlers of Grayson County, and each of the people in the photographs were identified. Whether they're correct or not, that's of course up to the people who are related to these people. But they're very accurate, very interesting, and contain a lot of information that would be valuable to a genealogist if your family happened to come from Grayson County. The important thing here is you might be surprised at what you find in these local and county and state histories. So search for the name of the location plus the word history. That's all you have to do. So if you want to look for the Grayson County history book here, just put in Grayson County. I put that in quotes so you don't get everything from Grayson and everything from county. But then you can put in the word history, and up pop all sorts of histories of Grayson County, Texas. Do the same thing with any other location out there. You might be surprised at what you find once again. Surname books. Okay, well, the surname book that I mentioned a few moments ago was the idea that you're writing about a prominent relative. Many times that prominent relative or ancestor was the immigrant, the person who came to America, the first person who came to America. In this case, we have a book that is on my surname family. It mentions a William Tanner of Rhode Island and his descendants. And it was published back in 1905, and then another copy was published, or an updated copy was published in 1910. Well, the interesting thing about this, and something that really should be noticed in looking at any of these books and materials, is the fact that they need to have some kind of sources listed. Now, the interesting thing about this particular book, on my surname book, is that the author did list his sources, and to some extent. It wasn't the fact that he didn't tell us where he got the information. It's that he basically put in information about many people in the Tanner family and assumed they were all William Tanner. In fact, as I've gone back and done the research, I found that there may be as many as few as 2 and as many as 5 or 6 or even more people in Rhode Island who were contemporaries back in the 1700s and early 1700s named William Tanner. It was a fairly common name back then, and they had a tendency to call all their kids William. And so there's all sorts of William Tanners floating around. And the person who is identified as the ancestor here is not really identified. The book does not say that he is the parent of my most remote ancestor. But this book is accepted as, and he is accepted, William Tanner is accepted as the progenitor because simply because people haven't looked at the book carefully. And for a second reason is because they haven't gone and done additional research that was not done clear back in the 1800s. So this is a sort of a warning and a caution about getting into some of these books, and it's the one that predominates among some genealogists who dismiss books altogether. But the information that has come out of this book is valuable if for no other reason that it's made me do years of research. So that's just the nature of them. So you search for your surname plus the complete or a complete name of your ancestor plus the location. And I would add in the word genealogy because, um, for example, if I do searches for some of my ancestors, I get all sorts of different people since they had common names. So it's sometimes difficult to differentiate. You might play around with the terms that you use. And also remember that Google uh, actually does different searches if depending on the order of your citations. Now, I mentioned instructional books, guides, manuals, and textbooks. It would seem to be too much like school, like going back to school, to sit down and go through a textbook or an instructional book on how to do genealogy. But um, my beginning, after I'd been doing collecting genealogical information for probably 8 or 10 years, I finally got to the point where I said, I got to figure out what I'm doing here, and got a hold of a copy of this book called The Researcher's Guide to American Genealogy by Val D. Greenwood. This is the third edition, and I subsequently purchased a copy of this book online and got the physical paper book as opposed to a digital copy. But I date my beginning of my becoming more and more aware of how to do genealogy by reading through cover to cover of this book on doing genealogy in America. And it just basically was the starting point for, and I began to understand at that I needed classes, I needed more books, and I needed to learn how to do this, how to do what I was attempting to do as a genealogist, and that's kind of where I ended up. And another one out there that was kind of pivotal in my learning was The Source. It's a very big book. It's been digitized. It's available on a wiki that's put online from Ancestry. You may not have known that Ancestry had a wiki, but there is an Ancestry wiki, and it has the incomplete text, and it's been updated of this book called The Source. And one of the things that happened to me as I began doing more and more and becoming more and more involved in genealogy it just happened, and there's nothing that just happens in genealogy, but I did get to meet the person who started writing this book, the first edition. Not on this third edition, and not mentioned as the title, but they do mention that she was instrumental in creating this particular work. And her name is Arlene Ickel. And Arlene has a PhD, and she is a professional genealogist of the highest order, one of the most knowledgeable people I have ever met in genealogy. And she's still around, and she's still active, and she's still publishing books. And as a matter of fact, as things progress in the world and things become very kind of get really strange after a while, is that Arlene and I and Holly Hansen and a few other people have co-authored most of the books that I've written. So we are now co-authors So that's kind of, and she dates back to the origin of this particular book, The Source. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, folks, we have the Complete Idiot's Guide to Genealogy. Now, if you need it at this level, I suggest that you start at this level, but you really do need to look at some of the more serious publications. That's pretty serious. Actually, it does a good job. I've looked at it, and it's not something I would use or read, but it's out there and it helps and it might get you started. Search for genealogy and then a topic, any topic you want to talk. It's interesting. You might put the word book in there if you're actually looking for a book, and that would help you to find all sorts of things. Most of the libraries, like the public libraries in the United States, if they have a book on genealogy, they'll probably have something like the Complete Idiot's Guide to Genealogy. They may have a copy of The Source, and they could have Al Greenwood's book. They've got, but you're going to find on how to do an instructional books and things like that. You're going to find slim pickings in most of the libraries, smaller libraries. General History and Geography, the History of the United States, second edition, of course, guidebook. Um, there are, probably thousands and thousands of history and geography books out there. It's really absolutely a good idea to get a basic idea of genealogy. Excuse me, of history in order to do your genealogy. Geography of North America. There is one thing that's always surprising to me is how little people know about our geographic world. How many people used to do it. And I think we're not going to tell all those stories. We'll just say that both historical and geographical knowledge among the general population is kind of in a dismal state. And unfortunately, it makes it difficult for people who are interested in genealogy, is that there's kind of a learning curve where they finally realize that they really have to learn about why their ancestors left Ireland, or why they came to America, or how they got across the country from Massachusetts to Ohio, or to Iowa, or to Kansas, or someplace. So you can search for the history of geography plus a topic. So, American history, history of Massachusetts, history of the colonial times, whatever, and you find that. Now, there's one caveat here, and that is watch out for political and social propaganda. Most of these books, a lot of books that are being published and have been published over the years, are nothing more than a bunch of propaganda. They are almost not historical documents. They're very, and some of them have extensive bibliographies, and they look very academic, and they look very sound extremely nonpartisan, non-controversial, and they are in fact nothing more than social propaganda. So it's going on every day in the United States. By the way, I just saw a news article here in Utah that I won't mention, that where they're changing the name of a canyon here in Utah, because the name of the canyon is now politically incorrect. So we have to change the names of our society and rewrite this. We're going to talk about social and cultural commentaries. The kinds of books that I think are valuable are like this book, Albion the Seed. If you don't read any other, if you have any ancestors that came from New England, or came from England, not just New England, but from England, then read Albion's Seed. That'll help you understand where your ancestors, how they got here, why they came, and what they did when they got here, and what kinds of traits. You'll be surprised at the things that you do in your family if you have English ancestry, that you'll find in this Albion Seed have been done for hundreds and thousands of years. So this is kind of a pivotal book, and there are many other books out there like this, and they're very, very important. But again, watch out for political and social propaganda. They're also kind of difficult to find because they're not classified as genealogy, and they're not classified as history sometimes. So they're something you have to know that they're out there or come across. And one way to find out about them is just have people tell you what their favorite books are. Transcripts and reproductions, this index to probate records. In this case, search for jurisdiction, for example, the place and the record type, and include the word book. So if you want about probate records for Bristol County, then look for Bristol County probate records, put the word book in, and if there is one, it may come up on a search, and very possibly could be. Archive and library publications. This is one from the Library of Congress, Afro-American History Sources for Research. And there are the larger libraries are in the business of publishing books about how to do research in certain areas, and search for the books with the name of the library or archive. So look for publications on genealogy from the Library of Congress, or look for publications on history of whatever background, German immigrants to America, and look for the library publication on that, and that will give you some information in a book. If you are not familiar with it, then this is the basic source for finding books online. This is worldcat.org. This is a compilation of over 2 billion catalog entries in thousands and thousands of libraries around the world. And you can search here just like you would with Google, but understanding that what you're searching here is catalogs. You're searching the book catalogs, and it helps to learn how the catalogs work and how you go about searching for information in a library. But this is the premier source after Google for finding information out there on any subject, and particularly on genealogical subjects. For books, if you want to look for books, take the subjects that I've talked about so far and look for them in WorldCat, and you will find literally hundreds, in some cases thousands, of books written on each of the subjects that you search for. And they will tell you exactly which libraries have the books and how you can obtain, and whether or not a digital copy of the book has been published and is available. So you can search on any name or topic. Even put your surnames in here, put your names of your ancestors in here, all sorts of things. Just search on anything that you can think of that might help you find information about your family. And look at the editions for an ebook. So you view all editions and copies, and then you've got all the ebooks listed. Here's an example of print books and an ebook available. So looks for books in the public domain on archive.org. Everything on archive.org is in the public domain. There's no copyright restrictions on anything on this website. 14 million books with no copyright restrictions. And then also look on the Hathi Trust. I've got an extra T in there, sorry. Didn't notice that until just now, but it's HATHI trust.org. And the Hathi Trust is a compilation of member universities across the country. And again, there are millions of books, and millions of them are in the public domain. So they're completely searchable and completely readable on the Hathi Trust. At the end of this, just go visit a library and start looking for books, folks. Walk up and down the shelves, pull off the stuff you're interested in. You know, exercise a small degree of self-control and stay away from the mysteries and science fiction, and just, read something that has some substance. So walk up and down and look for books, and you might be, and then check to see if the book's been digitized, just in case you don't want to, have to pay for it, or if you're wanting to do that. FamilySearch.org books has thousands of books. And I would suggest you just keep looking, because you're going to find all sorts of information that's unexpected. Thanks for watching, and we are glad you were able to come to another BYU Family History Library webinar, and remind you all that these are published, uploaded on our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, youtube.com. Search for BYU Family History, and please subscribe, because it helps us get out of the, morass of dogs and cats and explosions and people blowing things up and tearing them apart and doing all sorts of things that they do on YouTube. Thank
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today for another webinar. I'd like to remind you also to follow us on our social media sites, and we can help you stay up to date on what's new that we are offering here at the Family History Library. Um, Also, please let us know if you have any feedback for today's webinar. Let us know if there's anything we can improve. Also, if there's anything that you really enjoy that we can continue to do is also appreciated. Our next webinar, like I said, is on Tuesday of next week, and we hope to see you then. Have a great weekend.